2009, she published her PhD dissertation as Communities of Play at MIT Press, which introduced the concept of game refugees and built on the growing discussion on productive play. She also co-authored Ethnography in Virtual Worlds, a Handbook of Methods at Princeton 2012, which has been widely adopted as a textbook in Internet, online game, and virtual worlds research. She was a co-PI for the Reynard Project in 2015, and she co-authored, along with Carl Szymborski and Bobby Ray Blackburn, the first transludic survey covering non-game virtual worlds. As a game designer, her work has been particularly focused on emergent social behavior, both as a topic of study and as a catalyst for game design. Everyone, please help me welcome Celia Pierce. Celia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Letty, and it's great to be here. I want to welcome everyone, and I want to give a shout out to some of my collaborators and co-authors in the audience, some of whom were mentioned in the intro, and thanks to everybody for coming. So I'm going to talk about this topic of legacy today. The title of my talk is The More Things Change, the More They Stay the Same, 20 Years in Virtual Worlds. But as I was writing it, I realized I needed to revise the title slightly, and so now it's called 30 Years in Virtual Worlds. And then I thought, actually, no, it's really 40 years in virtual worlds. Well, actually, it's more like 80 years in virtual worlds. And in some of the stuff I'm going to talk about actually goes back about 150 years. So this is my conversation about legacy. And I think it's a very important topic, and I'm really honored that I was asked to come and speak with you all to inaugurate this conference. A couple things I am not going to talk about just up front, so you know. I'm not going to talk about virtual reality. I'm not going to talk about video games, and I'm not going to talk about augmented reality, at least for the most part. So if you wouldn't mind stepping into your favorite time travel vehicle, I'd like to take you back to the history of our medium and also some of the precursors of the virtual world we stand in today. In the beginning, there was the Word. And I like to say this for a couple of reasons. First, virtually every movement in virtual world has a book associated with it. And also, the very first virtual worlds were made entirely of words. This is one of the few games I am going to talk about. This is Richard Bartle and Roy Trubshaw, the creators of MUD, the multi-user dungeon. And this was the first that we know of networked virtual world in the sense that we mean today, where they created an entire world out of words on a computer. Where this originated, or what it was inspired by rather, was other words, including the advent of text-based adventures, which were single-player forms, in which you would be surrounded in a world, usually couched in a second-person voice, telling you where you were and what your options were. And you could explore that world. It was a very explorable space. It was somewhat static in that you couldn't really change anything, but you could go to a lot of different places and try a lot of different things and interact with this world through text. The other big inspiration was the 1937 fantasy classic The Hobbit by way of Dungeons & Dragons. And for those of you who play massively multiplayer games, all the multiplayer games today, especially the fantasy-based ones, but even the other genres, all are based on this essential dice model that was introduced with Dungeons & Dragons, the tabletop game in the 1970s. So Bartle and Trubshaw, who were college students at the time, were enthralled by these two books and decided it would be fun to create an imaginary world that they could share with each other and their friends. At this point, you have to remember that the networks were very constrained. They were mostly on college campuses, mostly in computer science departments, and mostly occupied by white males, which explains a lot about how these genres evolved and who they appeal to. However, we can see by stepping back even further in history that the idea of creating make-believe worlds and having little environments that we played in is actually quite old. Here are some images of dolls' houses, even dolls' houses that you would build yourself, and the idea of a customizable avatar or a representation that we would play through really is quite an age-old play pattern and idea that goes back many, many centuries. We also have other play forms for boys who like to play with dolls. This is the book Little Wars, which was published in 1913 by H.G. Wells, the science fiction author, more words. And this created a revival in wargaming, miniature wargaming, which had also been really popular in the 1880s. If you read closely, you can see that the cover says that it's a game that's suitable for boys and little girls. I think it says the smarter type of girl who likes boys' games. And I somehow stumbled upon this lovely picture showing the smarter type of girl who likes boys' games playing them in her underwear. We also have recent discoveries in literature and humanities that show that the Bronte family, including all three sisters and their brother, were creating imaginary worlds similar to the Tolkien-esque environment as far back as the 1830s. So this idea of combining imagination and creating our own worlds is really, again, quite old. There's also many hobbies that in many ways resemble the virtual world practices that we have today. This is a shot from the Eames film Toccata for Toy Trains, but the Toy Train Kit is a great paradigmatic example of something that merges creativity and technology in a social context. And then we also have various forms of character customization, from figurines from Dungeons and Dragons on the left to doll making and doll dressmaking, as well as emergent forms of creativity that can happen with various kinds of toys and games. I thought these three prim-headed Lego people were perfect for the Second Life context, since really we're all made of prims. Well, I guess now we're made of mesh as well, but this is the essential ingredient of our world. So this idea, the more things change, the more they stay the same, is really my way of saying very few things are really completely new. And in order to make things that are new, we really need to understand what is old. Because if we don't understand what happened before, we don't have the ability to make things that truly are new. And so I like to say, why reinvent the wheel when you can invent the car? So I hope that all of you that are involved in virtual world education and creation and research will take heed to this and really learn about your roots, because I think we can all do much more innovative things the more we know about what preceded us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as three waves of virtual world development. And I started with the Bartle world, and that's kind of the first instance we have of a networked virtual world on computers that's multi-user. In 1984, this book, Neuromancer, was published, written by William Gibson. And this book was the book that introduced the term cyberspace. And now we use cyberspace in a very broad sense to mean almost anything that happens on the internet and in network computing space. But when Gibson introduced the term, 33 years ago, I guess, he actually meant something very specific. He meant a spatialized space that you could inhabit. In his case, it was an abstract space that represented data. It wasn't a figurative space. There were no avatars. It was a giant abstract space of three-dimensional data, which was run by corporations and intervened and hacked into by renegade, what we now would consider cyberpunk characters. And it was right around this time that the first graphical virtual world was created. And it's interesting because it's nothing like the cyberspace that Gibson envisioned. Has anyone seen this before? Is anyone familiar with this? Just, you can type in the text box if you've seen this. I know a few of you have, because I've written about it with you. But this is Habitat, exactly. Good guess. Yay. So Habitat was the first graphical virtual world. It came with the Prodigy service. This was actually kind of amazing because they introduced the term avatar, which they brought out of, adapted from the Hindu word for God's instantiation on Earth. I'm sure a lot of people are aware of this. But they did this with a modem in 1986. So you can see that there's a very narrow bandwidth of information that can be conveyed. There wasn't a lot of user-created content, but there was a lot of socializing. It was basically sort of a graphically enhanced text environment. Chip Morningstar and Randall Farmer were the creators of this, and yeah, they were involved in it for many years. It actually evolved into a later product, which I'll show you a little bit later. In 1990, LambdaMoo was founded, was created by Pavel Curtis, and this was developed as an experiment in distributed collaboration at Xerox PARC. So it's really the first computer-aided collaborative work application, interestingly enough, although in many respects it became the first computer-aided collaborative play application, much more so than a work application. But the idea of this is that this is again, a textual space, but unlike MUD, which is a game and which has a structure and rules and goals, it's a sort of an open-ended exploratory world, but what was really unique about it was that people could add to it. So if you walked into this space, you were essentially walking into a textual description of Pavel Curtis's home in Silicon Valley, and or maybe it was in Seattle. But anyway, you're walking into a description of his home, and people could add their own components. So for instance, somebody put a tree house in a tree there, another person put a little world inside of the television set. You actually start in the coat closet of his house and enter from there. You can describe your avatar in a variety of different ways. So this was kind of the first time we have what we now call user-created content, where the players were actually co-creating the world along with the developer. This is a very interesting case study that I highly urge everyone to look into because there's a lot of good documentation about it, which is actually kind of rare for these early projects. First of all, one of the most sensational narratives around this was an article that was written by Julian DeBell in 1993 called A Rape in Cyberspace. And this is really the first extensively recorded instance we have of online harassment in a virtual world. This was a case where a player described a sexual assault on another player in a fair amount of graphic detail. And what it did was it created the necessity within this brand new virtual world for laws, which Pavel Curtis hadn't really thought about, but suddenly people felt their rights were being violated, and then you had to protect their rights. And so they developed a hierarchy and a governance system so that people could, help have some way of protecting themselves from these kinds of assaults and other kinds of problems that might arise. This is a great case study for my interest, which is emergent behavior, and it looks at both how the emergent behavior happens and also what the response to it is, which I think is really important. He later wrote a book called My Tiny Life, which chronicles a year within LambdaMoo. There's also a wonderful paper about, by a law professor actually, about the development of these rules. So some of the other worlds that happened in this period, the Palace in 1994, which was essentially a 2D chat space, but it did have affordances for user-created content, both in terms of the backgrounds and also in terms of people being able to export in images for their characters and customize their avatars, which were basically just, we almost might think of these as kind of proto-emojis in a way. They're very simple, but they do have some expressive affordances. Around this time, Habitat, this is 1996, Habitat was transformed into Worlds Away. There's a couple of interesting phenomena that are recurring throughout all these worlds that you can sort of see here. One is furries. Very early, people are starting to portray themselves in human, quasi-human or non-human form, but the idea of a human body with an animal head goes back several decades. And also cybersex, or slexting as we call it here, which we see pervasive in every virtual world regardless of its affordances. As soon as you get people together in a space, you get making whoopee, I guess is the best way to describe it. So then we have the second wave, which are 3D persistent worlds. And again, we have a book implicated in this arc. This book is Snow Crash, which I may have just passed because I overclicked. There we go. Neal Stephenson published this book in 1993. It introduced the term metaverse, which is now pretty commonplace in our world. And it also reintroduced the term avatar, which I believe Stephenson was not aware of had already been in use nearly a decade before. But it was directly responsible for the explosion in virtual worlds in the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s. One interesting development that is somewhat forgotten at this point is the VRML markup. This is the virtual reality markup language. And it was started by Tony Parisi and Mark Pesce in 1995. And what they wanted to do was create something like HTML for 3D. And what it was, and the reason I wanted to bring it up is because it's a Prim-based system. And many of the ingredients or fundamental ideas behind this ended up in Second Life, even though it didn't actually use this platform. As many of you who've been around a while know that the original Second Life world was entirely Prim-based. And so understanding prims and how to use them was a big part of this. And it basically had to do with bandwidth and trying to move three-dimensional objects across the rather narrow pipes we had at the time. So we had to come up with better ways of rendering and moving data between computers in real time, which still remains a problem to this day. The first really big virtual world that we had was Active Worlds in terms of 3D graphical worlds. This is still running to this day, over 20 years in business. And the left side are two maps, aerial maps, showing Alpha World, which is the base world. This was actually taken right around 1999, 1998, something like that, just showing sort of the emergent growth of the community there. It looks a lot like the San Fernando Valley, if anyone is from Los Angeles. And the other two images on the left, the top one is a user-created environment, a couple made after gravity was introduced as a feature of the software. They built a ski resort. And the lower left is a wedding. This is a common theme you'll see in a few of my slides, is this, again, the Making Whoopi theme, where people are not only becoming intimate, but also forming committed relationships, and we have a lot of records of this in a variety of different virtual worlds and game research. Another world that was introduced at this time was Black Sun. This world was actually, the name of this company was directly drawn out of the book, Snow Crash. That was the name of the company that owned the virtual world that Snow Crash talked about. They had to change their name to BLAXXUN, due to a lawsuit from Sun Microsystems. Another environment that came out at that time, which was actually acquired by Black Sun, was Cybertown. So these are all virtual worlds that have some accommodation of user-created content. As you can see, there were quite a few of them, and these are just a few. There were many, many more that came out, and there were many companies where various services were being provided having to do with creating environments and avatars and whatnot for virtual worlds. There was actually already a business brewing in avatar customization where people would hire people to make avatars for them. And this is Digital Space Traveler, which was originally called OnLive. And this was a different approach, and I wanted to show this just for those of you, especially who are designers and who use virtual worlds to teach design. I think it's interesting that these early proto 3D worlds had to make some trade-offs because they had very few polygons to deal with. And so what they did was these guys actually took a vastly different approach. The other worlds of the time involved full-body humanoid avatars, but as you can see, these avatars are very rudimentary because we don't have a lot of polygons to work with for real-time animation at this point, and we're also still not quite in a broadband context. But what they decided instead to do was to just focus on the face, and so avatars only had heads, but they were three-dimensional, and they also introduced this really wonderful feature of a lip sync, which now is commonplace in virtual worlds, but at the time was a pretty bold innovation. So as you can see, my lips are moving while I'm talking. That's pretty common, but in those days it was kind of a big deal. So these were some different approaches to the design. A lot of this work culminated around 1997. there were a bunch of different things that happened that year, including, well, the first actual in-world virtual world conference about virtual worlds that took place in a virtual world took place in 1998, I believe it was. But this was a follow-through of these conferences that had started in 1996, Earth to Avatars, Avatars 97. These were organized by Bruce Damer and the Contact Consortium. I talk a little bit about them in my first book, the interactive book. But the very first one of these that took place in a virtual world was 1998. This is in the virtual world, Active Worlds, and it's a full conference convention with sessions and everything that we're doing now 20 years ago. So when I saw the decade of legacy on the description of the theme this year, I thought, oh boy. I was at this conference. I was one of the presenters, and this was a full conference, and it had booths, and he did these for a couple of years. For the first 2 or 3 years, we went to San Francisco for these conferences, and then he said, well, let's just all talk about virtual worlds and virtual worlds. And so this is the precursor of what we're doing here today. And really, if you look at it, other than the fact that the graphics quality is pretty bad, it's honestly, we haven't evolved much in 20 years. So this is why I want people to know about this stuff, because maybe we can come up with something new and even more interesting to do with these spaces. And now I want to talk about the third wave. And I call this the gaming era because I think that a lot of the technological developments that enabled this third wave to take place really came out of the fact that gaming became hugely popular, and bandwidth suddenly became a bigger issue than it had been during the email and internet, World Wide Web era. People wanted more bandwidth. They also wanted better graphics. You started to see graphics cards come out that people would buy and install in their computers in order to get better results with their gaming software. And I think that this paved the path for much more sophisticated virtual world development. I'm going to start with a couple of kind of edge cases that kind of represent this transition into the third wave. But I wanted to mention them because you've probably never heard of them, and they're unbelievably popular. So the first one is Yville. Has anyone heard of this virtual world? Feel free to shout out in the text chat. Yville was started in 1999, and as you can see, it's a 2D world. It's still running. It has about 30 million active users last time I checked. 60% of them are girls. It's a science learning world, and I wanted to show this to you because I know a lot of people here are educators. This, to me, if you want to talk about the best practices in virtual world education, this is the high water mark right here. Everyone should go look at this. It's basically a virtual world that's full of science games and activities, and they do partnerships with people like the Centers for Disease Control. They did a whole thing with, I think it was either Honda or Toyota, about electric cars. They did a whole thing about vaccinations. And they come up with these really beautiful, simple little social games for kids to play together to learn about scientific ideas and engineering and STEM and so forth. Developed by an artist and a scientist initially at Caltech, and then spun off into their own company. A really wonderful company. I highly recommend checking it out. Another one that is also still in operation is Habbo Hotel. This was developed in Finland in 2000. This is also for kids. It is essentially kind of a Lego-like world. It looks weirdly a little bit like Minecraft, but it's an isometric world. It was designed to be played on lower-end computers. Both of these actually were specifically designed to be played on lower-end computers so that young kids could play them. But they're targeted to essentially the young 8 to 12, 13, tween age. And this is more of a social world, but kids can make their own environments. The picture on the lower left is a garden that was made by a kid with just taking landscaping elements and furniture elements and building this kind of Mayan pyramid garden. Habbo also did a licensing deal with Coke, which was doing a lot of stuff in virtual worlds back in this period. They also had a pavilion in there.com at one point. But this was a children's, again, Habbo-style environment that was themed around the Coke brand. The Sims Online came out in 2002, and I think I wanted to bring this up because I think it's kind of, again, sort of a transitional edge case. And a lot of people ended up coming into both there.com and Second Life from The Sims Online, who essentially were looking for what we eventually came to found in places like this. But The Sims Online was an interesting case because it kind of ate itself with its emergent behavior problems. There were a couple of things I think that were problematic. One was that the thing that had made The Sims so popular was the user-created content, and the company didn't allow that user-created content into the multiplayer world, and I think that was a mistake. And also there was not very good moderation or social tools at that point, and so there began to be this kind of what they called the Sims Mafia, which overran it. This was the original topic that I wanted to cover in my PhD dissertation, but when I got to The Sims Online, everybody was gone. And actually they had immigrated into other virtual worlds, and I'll talk about that towards the end of my talk here. The main two virtual worlds that really, I think, started the third wave would be There, which, as people know, has closed and reopened. Was closed in 2010, but I put the little plus mark there because by popular demand it was reopened. I know a number of people here are There, current or former There people. And There was similar to Second Life, but it was a lot more cartoony aesthetic, a much more consistent and controlled look and feel, as well as highly controlled, monitored user-created content. It was actually an all-ages environment, so they didn't want to allow adult content in there. And it's funny because for those of you who are native Therians in the audience, there always used to be these jokes about Second Life and all of the sex stuff going on here. And in fact, there were even some very funny little machinima films that Therians made, poking fun at the attachments that people here used. And these are some shots of Second Life in 2003. I was a beta tester, actually. This is my original beta avatar. That's probably why it's got system close, among other things. But you can kind of see that it was pretty rudimentary when it first started. But again, we have weddings. There's a shot of the infamous Second Life avatar customization tools, which are extensive. And I just want to show you a couple examples. I mean, you guys have probably spent tons of time here. This is actually some older images of the Caledon and Victorian and steampunk community, which I like to mention just because they've been there, for a very, very long time, evolved over time. They've adopted I think you guys have a constitution now, right? There's a, it's a considered to be a territory with a government. I was always really impressed with how different Second Life communities. I remember going to a meeting with one of my research subjects where they were talking about weapons protocols between different communities, so that if you took a gun from a pirate community into a steampunk community, it would work, and all these kinds of standardization efforts that people were making here. And I've always been impressed with the steampunk community in terms of the stuff they make. They make some of the most interesting and imaginative both environments and artifacts. And the steampunk community is a great example of a type of emergent behavior that's a hybrid of a lot of different narratives and storylines. Another example is a much more sort of direct fandom situation where we have here with the Pandora Sim. This came out just around the time of the movie, actually really shortly after the movie, and it was quite beautiful and well done. And people had to wear, Na'vi avatars in there to be in the world. There was a lot of hype around Second Life at this time, especially around real money transactions and what I call professionalization, where people's play activities become income generating. You probably remember this, some of you probably remember this cover story in Business Week, which was kind of a big deal because it was the first time virtual worlds were on the cover of a magazine other than something like Wired or Mondo 2000. It was a little more mainstream. And that was right around the time that I started my dissertation. Actually, I finished my dissertation right around that time. I had been working on it since 2001. Some of you probably know this work around game refugees. I studied the players of Uru, which was open for about 18 months from 2003 to 2004. these players, and I'm sure there's a bunch of Uruvians out in the audience. I recognize some of the names. Uru refugees are everywhere, and they immigrated into Second Life and to there. I spent quite a bit of, most of my research time, I spent 18 months doing ethnography with the Varian Uru refugee community. But also in Second Life, there were people doing really great stuff. A couple of phenomena that I discovered there were the idea of people carrying their identities between worlds, and this idea of sort of transludic communities and transludic identities that go from one virtual world to another. I also looked at this idea of productive play. A few other people were writing about this at the time, but how play becomes productivity in terms of creative output. Below at the bottom, you see two. You see on the left is the one of the original levels of Uru, and then on the right is the Second Life recreation. So at this time, I was also I did a lot of work on defining virtual worlds and looking at kind of this range between virtual worlds and games, and I came up with this idea of kind of this spectrum of different types of virtual worlds. So on the far left, you have the fixed synthetic world, which is typically a game world. It's usually goal-oriented or ludic. It has very strong rules of play, usually a very prevalent narrative that dictates those rules. And then on the far right, you have the co-created worlds like Second Life, There.com, Active Worlds. And then there's this space in the middle, which at the time, this was 2009 when I finally published the book, this space was kind of barren. I felt like it would be, I kept thinking, well, there's all these gamers running around and there's a lot of people in virtual worlds, but they never seem to overlap. There's a few people who travel back and forth, but by and large, people that play in virtual worlds are not playing games, and vice versa. And I thought it would be interesting. So the work that I did when I was at Georgia Tech, I'm not going to talk about it because I don't really have time, but I actually tried to develop some games that occupied this interstitial space, and some of the work I'm doing now is also trying to do that. But I want to show you a couple of examples of what I consider to be kind of various attempts at merging games and virtual worlds really quickly, since we have very little time left. PlayStation Home was an attempt to create a virtual world for gamers in PlayStation. It was free for all PlayStation, I think 3 owners or PlayStation 2 owners. Didn't last very long. I actually did some work on they did a kind of rebranding and redevelopment of it. But the big problem with it was that these people just wanted to play games. And we did put some games in, but they wanted something a little more structured. In 2010, there was this really wonderful virtual world that was out for probably no more than a year called Papermint. And this was a really nice hybrid because it had a sort of a game mechanic, mostly revolving around color. And so you could go in and you could harvest different colors from the various plants around, and then you would have those colors in your inventory, and you could color your clothes or your houses or your furniture. And it was a very social world and a very kind of a lightweight play mechanic. Another example of something along these lines was Glitch, which ran from 2011 to 2012. Also a virtual world with a refugee community, which is still very active. And this was a game that had some trading and gifting mechanics. It had this really wonderful karma mechanic where you could give presents to people and get karma points. And I think really the pinnacle of this merger of games and virtual worlds is Minecraft. This is actually a picture of a Minecraft mod of Habbo Hotel, which I stumbled on while I was doing the research for this talk, and I thought it was hilarious. And Minecraft, as you know, it began as a game. It really wasn't intended to be a virtual world, but it's really sort of turned into digital Lego. And people have done unbelievable things with it. This is the Westeros Minecraft mod, which simulates the entire Westeros world from Game of Thrones inside and out. And Mistcraft, which is a full functional simulation of Myst. And as we know, Minecraft was purchased by Microsoft for a ridiculous amount of money in the billions. I actually made this meme. There was somebody made this Minecraft mod that said originally, it looks like you're trying to open Minecraft, and I modified it to buy So this leaves us with the question, what next? What does the fourth wave of virtual worlds look like? I don't really have the answer to that, but I have a sneaky feeling it's going to have to do with these three things I said I wasn't going to talk about. Virtual reality, which is now finally that's a whole other legacy lecture. If anyone wants that one, I'm happy to give it. Virtual reality is back again. Games and augmented reality. I think those three things are going to start to converge with virtual worlds, and that we will see those experiences kind of begin to overlap and come together in a variety of different ways. So with that thought, I'm going to just, since most of you are educators and you're not afraid of books, I'm going to just splash through some recommended readings, and then we'll have questions. First of all, this is just a sort of pastiche of a bunch of books everyone should read. There's a couple of books here specifically on the stuff I'm talking about. Everything across the top are books about essentially virtual reality from the 80s through the 90s. The lower books, the bottom two left books, are about tabletop role-playing games. Very good. One is a history of Dungeons and Dragons. Play Money and My Tiny Life are Julian DeBell's books. Play Money is about the economics of virtual worlds, a very good book. And then two books, if you're on the theoretical side, that I highly recommend. A lot of the material about doll houses and things like that, you can get in more depth with Mary Flanagan's Critical Play, which I highly recommend. And then Narrative is Virtual Reality by Marie-Laure Ryan is really a great discussion of kind of what is the underlying idea of a virtual world as a narrative form. And finally, Tom Belstorff is in the audience, so here's his book, Coming of Age in Second Life, which is fantastic, a really lovely read. And then I love Thomas Malaby's book, Making Virtual Worlds. We don't know a lot about how these things are made, and he did an ethnographic study of Linden. So if you want to know what the Lindens are really like, you can read Malaby's book. And I also want to just give a plug for a study that I did with Carl Szymborski and Bobby Ray Blackburn, who were both, that was mentioned in the intro. There's a link here. This is a very comprehensive survey that we did a couple of years ago, Virtual Worlds, with some really interesting results, including if you want to know what percentage of virtual world denizens across all virtual worlds are women, we have that data for you. So, and then those are my books, including Ethnography in Virtual Worlds, which I wrote with Tom, who's here. I don't know if Bonnie made it, but yes. So, questions? I can't hear anything, so I think someone's going to translate for me, maybe.
Yes,
Ready?
if you have questions for Celia, go ahead and type them on text chat, and I can go ahead and feed them to her, so that way she can answer in voice.
And also, thank you so much for the text interpretation. I basically don't have the ability to deal with the cognitive load of talking and typing at the same time, so she did the translation for me, which was fantastic.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions. The first one is, what is your favorite thing to do in virtual worlds now, and which world?
Well, I have a double life. Actually, I have a second life. I spend pretty much every day I come to Second Life and I do historical role-playing, which is really right now my favorite thing to do. I also do that in real life. I do a lot of historical costuming. I just think it's a fantastic way to engage with history. I end up doing a lot of historical research as part of that, which is really fun. I've really learned a lot about the historical environment that I'm playing in. It's a fantastic way to learn, by the way. If you want to talk about best practices, take your students to historical sims, and they're all over the place, and they're all different eras, and most of the people that run them here are really, really hardcore, often professional historians and or hardcore history hobbyists. And that's kind of my main fun activity. Creatively, I'm actually doing, I'm kind of off screen at the moment. I've been doing physical games, and also I'm working on a very bizarre sort of augmented reality documentary game, an alternate/augmented reality documentary game, again, kind of dealing with historical subject matter. So generally speaking, I would have to say that I'm interested in like group interaction in the physical world in various capacities. And in terms of content, really historical content is kind of drawing me in more and more.
Great, thank you. I haven't seen another question, but somebody wanted to know if you'll make your slides, your presentation available somewhere for us. And we can, if you send it to me, I can make it available to on the website, or you can put it on SlideShare and just give me the link.
Oh, sure, I'll figure something out. Just shoot me an email and remind me. SlideShare, I think I could just, yeah, I'm a little reticent. I will say this, I've had people steal my slides. A couple of times I found slides of mine on SlideShare that I didn't put there. And I've also seen my slides in professors' syllabi. It makes me very nervous, but
I completely understand.
I'm okay to share it if everyone here can promise not to crib my notes and take credit for my work and publish my my slides without asking me first. Serena's.
We'll put a copyright. Yeah, we'll put a copyright on there as well for you.
Okay, cool. And somebody asked about Minecraft. You know, I've spent a little time in it. I had a Minecraft server at, the question was, have you used Minecraft at all? Sorry, I'm reading the questions. Is that okay?
Sure, that's fine. There was another one, but go ahead and answer that one, and then I'll feed you the other one.
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that because I'm actually going to do a Minecraft session with my students next week. We used to do them at my lab at Georgia Tech. We would just get together for an evening and get some pizza and play Minecraft for a few hours. I haven't spent as much time in it as I would like to. I find it a little bit, you know, one of the nice things about these virtual worlds is there's just one world to go to, so it's pretty easy to just, I'll go in this one place and I can find everything from this one place. But I do think it's a really interesting environment, and I'm curious to see what educators do with it now. They do make it pretty difficult. I mean, it was a huge pain to put it in our lab. It took us a couple of months to get the license sorted out and all of that. So I hope Microsoft is thinking about being a little more, I don't know, educator-friendly with it going forward. And what was the other question that I missed?
There was another question on if you've ever looked at OpenSim or particularly Hypergrid Connected, you know, for the types of virtual experiences that you describe.
I have. I've done a little work in OpenSim, and I've also done a little research. There were some. I did a study of women creators in virtual worlds, and I deliberately chose women who were working in different contexts, and one of the was two women working together, were working in OpenSim, and they were Uru refugees, and they were creating kind of their own Uru environment. I think for a lot of people from a refugee community, one of the things that has happened multiple times, like the Uru refugees went through the closure of Uru twice actually, or was it 3 times even? And then they had to go through the closure of there. So some of those people who left there came here, but some of them also went and decided that they didn't want to be involved with corporations anymore, and so OpenSim was very attractive to them for that reason. Yeah, it's a nice space if you want to do your own autonomous thing. The thing that I really like about a place like this is that there are people here. So if I go do OpenSim and do my own thing, I don't know people, and people tend to stay autonomous within their sims, even though it's on a big grid. I've never seen there form a big sense of community there. So that's my one kind of reticence.
Okay, there's another question regarding Unity 3D. What do you think of Unity 3D based virtual worlds like space or fieldscapes?
I don't know what those are. I will say that my other area of expertise is independent games. I'm one of the co-founders of IndieCade, as some of you probably are aware. And Unity has been a huge game changer in terms of creating an accessible tool for 3D games. So creation of 3D games. And they've also done a lot of work to cultivate the indie community to become affordable for the indie audience. So I think that if we are going to see anything with this next generation, and the other thing that Unity has been doing that's absolutely brilliant is that anytime anyone is doing anything having to do with virtual reality or with augmented reality, Unity partners with them. I remember that when the Oculus Rift came out, right away you could make Oculus Rift applications with Unity. It meant that there was a ton of content that came out very quickly, which is one of the things that I think is different from the prior virtual reality movements. And augmented reality, I'm using Vuforia right now. So it just makes it a lot easier to develop content. And I think, that the short answer to all these questions is it's the content stupid. And you need, for any technological platform to succeed, you need some good content. So I think that's a good place to close since we're out of time, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah?
We have about 5 minutes, so let me, there was a couple more questions. Maybe you can kind of answer those within the 5 minutes. One
Absolutely.
person kind of went back to the Minecraft. This person wanted to know what would be the purpose of playing Minecraft with students. And let me repost the question on chat. I believe that's what I grabbed.
Oh, well, I'm doing it's for a class called Designing Imaginary Worlds. And so we are going to be doing a few field trips into user-created imaginary worlds. And so I wanted to take them into some user-created, we're not actually going to play Minecraft. We're going to look at Minecraft mods. So we're going to download them and look at a few different ones that have been made by players. We're also going to do a Second Life tour as well, because the module of the class that we're in right now has to do with fan culture and participatory culture. So I want to see, things like this Pandora sim that I showed you earlier, and I'll probably take them to Caledon and to some other environments here that are adaptations or even original imaginary worlds that people have created.
And one final question in the last few minutes that we have left. It goes back to what you had said about, having your second life as a historian of sorts. Somebody wanted to know if you've ever been to the Time Portal build of Victorian London.
Yes, I have. Was there something else you wanted to know?
Well, that was it for the question, but so I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on how you felt about it, what was interesting about it, maybe.
Well, I have to tell you, my experience of it was very limited. I had a friend who liked to role play Mary Poppins. I would play Mary Poppins, and he would play, forgot the guy's name that she hung out with, and we mainly just played on the rooftops. So I've really only seen Victorian London from the roof. Yes, Bert, exactly. So we would go and play Bert and Mary Poppins on the roofs, which that's a great example though of what's so exactly. That is a great example of what's so great about virtual worlds is I can be Mary Poppins dancing on the roofs in London. I think that's pretty awesome.
Well, thank you very much, Celia. I think we're about 2 minutes away, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Everyone, please help me thank Celia for her helping us open our conference today. I believe she expressed an interest in staying back a little bit to chat with you all, but in the meantime, we're going to stop the stream. Celia, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, I'm going to try to figure out how to fix my voice so I can hear everybody. I'm going to just pop over. Can I take the HUD off now? I guess I'll just leave it on so you have the screen up. It's hard for me to see people. I'm going to take it. All right. Give me a second, everybody. I'm going to try to get myself over there, and then I have to fix all my volume settings so that I can talk to you.